Hello, I'm Doug Musio. This is part one of a special Middle East edition of City Talk. Surge in civil war in Iraq, Hamas-Fatah ceasefire in Palestine, Saudi Arabia and Iran talking, sitting down with the axes of evil, rays of hope. Joining me once again to talk about the Middle East is a distinguished Middle East hand, Richard Murphy, former U.S. ambassador to Mauritania, Syria, the Philippines, and Saudi Arabia. He has served as Assistant U.S. Secretary of State for Near Eastern and Asian Affairs and has been named Career Ambassador. He is a frequent TV commentator and widely consulted expert and a too infrequent guest here. Welcome, sir.
Glad to be back with you.
You literally have just come back. Jet-lagged? I mean, you were in the Middle East for a couple of weeks.
For about 3 weeks, and I came back last night, but my bags got back a couple of hours ago, for which I'm deeply grateful.
This is a plus. Talk about your trip. I got an email from you from Tripoli, and you say, have earlier been in Casablanca at a conference with Arab Reform and moderate Islamist religiously based parties. These are groups which our government generally avoids and some of which it officially blacklists. What was the purpose of your visit? What was the outcome?
Well, there were two sections to the trip. The first took place in Casablanca, where we had, we being a small group of Americans and Europeans, had a conference with Arab political figures who were not officials of the you might call the Arab Reform parties or the Arab Islamist parties, but are close enough to the leadership of those groups, such as Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, that they can tell us something about the way their organizations think, and in return we give them an idea of how American and Western European political leaders think about the area and how we frame our policies. I have to say, so far we've been going at this for about 3 years. Every 3 or 4 months we get together and we keep the same group, if at all possible, so that you put aside the rhetoric, put aside the polemics, and begin to relate to each other on a very practical working basis. I think they may have gotten a better understanding of Western thinking than we have yet gotten about theirs.
Why?
They're not used to thinking in the terms, perhaps it's more that they're not used to thinking in terms of policy making, because they're all excluded from policy making in their governments, in their particular countries. The Egyptian Islamic Brotherhood is not admitted to the government. Hamas is a party that is been elected by the Palestinians, but with which we don't deal,
and we'll talk about them.
They're having troubles getting together with the other Palestinian parties. Hezbollah is in the Lebanese government, but it has members in the Lebanese government, but we list that as a terrorist organization and will not talk to them officially. So it's a chance for Westerners to have an informal contact with people who are close to the leaders of those movements, to get a better understanding, and for them to take back home some understanding of us.
Some sense of movement, progress, however that's defined in these conversations?
Well, we started shortly after the invasion of Iraq, which has cast a pall over conversations and dominated thinking in the Middle East more than any other issue in my experience. So much of the time was spent on Iraq in this session and in earlier ones, trying to explain Well, yes, mistakes were made. Hey, we're able to admit it, frankly, in the way that our respective governments, and we had people there, former British ambassador, a German politician, French editor, and an Italian researcher. It's a very mixed group, able to say things which a sitting official could never say.
Right. Even if they were willing to do it.
Yeah, it's just not the way you talk when you're in government.
Okay, let's go to Iraq. Yeah. What, in your judgment, is the political and military situation, and what do you see the prospects being? And talk about it in strategic terms. Where are we meaning the United States, and where are we likely to go, and where should we go?
Well, frankly, I thought, and here I admit I was wrong, I thought a year ago we would have seen by now a clear drop in the American troop presence in Iraq. I thought by the end of '06 we'd be down by, say, 30,000. Didn't happen. Instead, we're going up by 21,000.
And we had an election that seemed to have suggested
that was the way the country, the majority, thought we ought to be going, but the administration thought otherwise. And the security situation has gotten worse. Now, my own sense of the meeting is that it has gotten worse in part because of our presence. There was a point, you could say, in '03, '04 that our military presence was a plus in keeping the lid on and giving people some time and space among the Iraqis to get together. It didn't happen, and some point in '05, '06, we crossed that barrier, and I think we're more of a problem there than we would be out of Iraq in terms of Iraqi internal reconciliation. Now, we didn't create sectarianism in Iraq. That's what the Iraqis are very quick to say, but if you talk to them long enough, they say, all right, there were tensions between Shia and Sunni over the centuries, but we had worked it out, and the coals were under the ashes. You came in and you stirred up the fire.
Legitimate?
That's fair. I think that's a fair analysis. Let me read you just from some notes I took at that meeting, just a brief comment that one of them, and I think he was speaking for the group, one of the Arabs was saying, and he was an Iraqi. He is an Iraqi. He said, the United States sacrificed for Iraqi democracy. Unfortunately, the way things have developed, most Iraqis dream of having another Saddam Hussein in charge, meaning stability, predictability. Miserable as he was, we knew where we stood. Now the criminals are in power. Your billions went to your corrupt companies and your corrupt allies in Iraq. Democracy, it's distorted in Iraq. If you want success, keep your distance. You're being opposed by force because you came in by force. And we Iraqis worry because the Europeans, whom we see as they see as a possible balancing force, are not there. And they're left just at American dictates. And that's why we want to see an international conference where Europe is represented. That was said in a very almost matter-of-fact way and not unsympathetic. You just say, yeah, you tried, you've lost blood, you've lost money, and it hasn't worked, and we're worse off.
The surge. It seems that this is not strategy. This is a tactic, and there is no strategy. We have no policy. I asked you the question about U.S. policy in the Middle East. Do we have a policy? Do we have anything approaching what would be a coherent system of beliefs with goals and objectives that are measured? I mean, is there anything like that?
We have the values, we have the beliefs, if you will, the American values of freedom and democracy, good for us, good for the world. And there's nothing that's going to get a quicker outburst of anger and frustration from an Iraqi or from many Arabs than to be told we have brought freedom and democracy to Iraq. But that's been the approach. That's our motivation. We know best. Look at our history. We have done extraordinary things with our country, with our people, the open borders, etc. If you'd only listen to us, you could do as well.
American hubris, the arrogance of power.
Take our values. Do like we do, like we have done in the past. And anyway, it for the moment it just isn't selling, and it hasn't worked.
Now, even if the surge succeeds, are you simply buying time? Are you buying time? And if you're buying time, what are you buying time for?
Well, I think the administration is officially buying time so that the Iraqi security forces, army and police, get more experience and more capabilities to take over the situation for themselves.
There was a piece in this issue of Foreign Affairs, the March-April 2007, by James Fearson, and he argues that the United States is actually supporting a government that is a partisan in a Shiite-Sunni civil war. And in a sense, U.S. success in Iraq will mean the victory of one of the parties, that we're really a partisan in this sectarian strife, whether intentional or not.
It's not intentional, I'm sure of that. It's utterly sincere that we would like to be avoiding a civil war. We didn't go in to solve a civil war, and we are not capable of solving a civil war. So, as we say, it didn't happen because of what we wanted, but nonetheless it has happened, and a group that were refugees from Saddam in Iran under Iranian protection for almost a generation are now running. They have the main power levers in their hands in Iraq. And we who talk so much about Iran, we'll come to that perhaps,
sure.
But the fact is we opened the door to Iran in Iraq by getting rid of Saddam Hussein. We eliminated their enemy on their west. We eliminated the Iranian enemy in the Taliban in Afghanistan. So why should we be surprised if all of a sudden they look larger than life in Iraq?
Another example of the law of unintended or perverse consequences.
Well, another sign that as kids we should have spent more time on geography. We talk about Iraq as if it was our backyard and not Iran's, as if Iran had no business there when they're the next door neighbor.
Well, and certainly the rhetoric of axis of evil, the invasion of Iraq, you would be shocked if the Iranians didn't react in a military, diplomatic, and otherwise way.
Well, what that kind of rhetoric has done is freeze our thinking about how to adjust our approach in Iraq. To talk of an axis of evil, to block off, put into that category Iran along with Korea, Iraq, Iran, and Korea originally, the three, and I guess we've added Syria as a honorary member now, has meant that we've dictated to ourselves, thou shalt not have contact with evil. We don't deal with evil until evil changes into something that we like.
But in fact, the two axes, Syria and Iran, are going to be part of this regional security summit in Iraq. In fact, next weekend. Right. Does this signal something on the part of the administration? And if it does, what is it signaling?
Well, I think...
Is it becoming more realistic?
I hope so, yes. It certainly is something which you could not have foreseen the way the White House, the way the Secretary of State was talking a year ago.
Right.
And this, you're talking about a change that in rhetoric at least has come only in the last couple of weeks.
Right. So
they are part of the problem, and by definition, they are going to be part of the solution.
I know our crystal balls are very cloudy. What do you see in Iraq over the next year, two, as it relates both internally and in the region? Do you have a sense of the direction of what's happening, or is it just too volatile?
It's very volatile. I see, unfortunately, a lot more bloodshed ahead, between Iraqis. The cry for revenge is out there on the part of the families who've lost the father, the husband, the son, the daughter, etc. And that's not going to be healed overnight. These wounds take a long time to heal. As I was saying, they went through earlier periods of trouble, and they came out of it with a rough arrangement between Shia and Sunni, which the Shia didn't like particularly, but they had been compelled to accept by earlier regimes, even before Saddam's. I'm afraid before they get back to whatever new stability, stable balance there is between the two main groups and the Kurds, there's going to be bloodshed, more bloodshed, settling of scores. And the Shia have now a power which they hadn't had for more than 1,000 years.
What does the United States do in response to this escalating and deepening violence that basically state power is broken down in Iran, regional, city, and in some cases neighborhood, gangs and militias fighting it out? Yeah. What do we do?
They range from the noble to the thug criminals in the streets of Baghdad and Anbar and other. They're not all noble strugglers for Iraq's national aims.
What do we do? What ought we do? What is our interest in the region, and how do we act to achieve those interests?
Well, I think this international conference, which is not going to be a magical solution or a brand new crystal ball, but the international conference, which will bring together all of the neighbors, plus the Europeans, ourselves, I imagine the Russians will be there, is a much needed and overdue step, because there will be ideas that come out there that the various countries, particularly those in the neighborhood, are going to have to help implement. We can have all the nice ideas about reconciliation, but if Turkey feels threatened by the Kurds' desire for independence, if Saudi Arabia feels very uneasy about the fate of the Iraqi Sunni, and Syria, for its own policies and its own reasons, is uneasy, then there's not going to be a solution. Nobody can be excluded from helping put the situation back into a more stable form.
And that gets to something that we addressed briefly earlier, and that is the unwillingness to talk with Iran and Syria. I guess this former secretaries of state and the national security advisors appeared before Congress, and they were almost universal. I mean, Kissinger talked about the United States always being ready to negotiate with Iran and Syria. Is the pressure building to change the perception of the reality out there?
Well, reality has snuck up on the administration and taken a big bite out of its rear end, you could say.
Ooh. Okay, let's turn to Palestine, Israel.
Yeah.
You, when you were assistant secretary, that was, your primary portfolio. There was the Hamas-Fatah agreements in February, the ceasefire, now the attempts to produce this unity government over the last weekend. What is the situation in Palestine, and what is the Palestinian-Israeli situation, and where are we headed with that?
Well, in Palestine, on the standard of living and the pressures on the ordinary Palestinian are way up. The cutoff in aid, which we led and the Europeans endorsed after Hamas was elected to be the government of the Palestinians a year ago, has really hurt. There's no question. Their situation, the people out of jobs, out of not getting their salaries on anything like a regular basis, has been very damaging, and the end is not in sight on that.
Why this counterproductive behavior again?
Well, we said rather pompously that we weren't bound to give foreign assistance just because somebody gets elected, and people have to live with the consequences of their vote. It was It's true.
Right.
Both are true.
But if you know what? But when you're pushing democracy, that's sort of a sour follow-up.
Yeah. Well, I agree. Now, where are they going? It's a struggle for power between Hamas and Fatah, the two main political factions. The Palestinian president, who we're happy to deal with, is from Fatah originally. He was a right hand of Yasser Arafat. But he can't dictate to Hamas how the new government will be formed. He is saying the goal should be to get the world back to dealing with us as Palestinians, and there've got to be some changes in your Hamas approach. And Hamas is saying, hey, we got elected, and we've done more for the people than Yasser Arafat ever did, and we got elected because we were more popular. That said, they hope to get a government together within the next 2 or 3 weeks. And it's not been easy. They have come to suspect each other. There have been shootouts, particularly in Gaza.
Sure.
And this has badly rattled a lot of the Palestinians who have still a very unhappy memory of some conflicts back in the 1930s, which nearly turned into a Palestinian civil war in those days. It's not in our interest. A civil war is not in our interest, in Israel's interest, really in anybody's out there. So the hope is that working with Abbas, the Palestinian president, and making clear our views, which we've done, God knows, on the conditions for dealing with Hamas, that they had to forswear violence and accept all previous Palestinian-Israeli agreements and Israel's right to exist. I personally think they can be moved in the right direction on all three scores. And we've seen the discipline that Hamas could exert when it decided, in its own interest, to have a ceasefire. It did stop Hamas-directed attacks. And you talk to some of these people, like I've been doing with the non-governmental types, they're under no illusions about the Israelis' existence and Israel's power and the likelihood that Israel is going to be a fact in their lives indefinite.
Who are the patrons? What are the larger politics involved in the Hamas-Fatah hyphen Israeli situation?
Well, Hamas campaigned against the Oslo Agreement back in '91. They didn't like it. They were a new organization in those days. They didn't like the terms that Arafat agreed to, and even less the way he conducted the Palestinian Authority from then till his death. They felt he gave away too much, got too little in return, is the most general statement of their views. Now, Fatah did get, if I may say, fat and lazy in power in the Palestinian power structure, and they were outdone, outperformed as a responsible authority by Hamas that was much more effective delivering welfare services, taking care of charity cases than the Palestinian Authority had become, which really accounts for their basic popularity. It was how I was, how I as a Palestinian was treated by somebody in authority.
What is the pressure externally for Hamas and Fatah to form a unity government and then abide by or accept the three conditions? What are the pressures here?
Well, we've stated our position, and as the Secretary Rice has said on other occasions, talking about the Middle East, they know our position, so let them move. We won't talk to Hamas. We won't deal with Hamas until it meets those three. And I think our ambition, or our idea a year ago when we laid out those conditions, was they would crack. They would in effect be destroyed politically. Hasn't happened.
Right.
And Fatah doesn't look any better to the average Palestinian today than it did a year ago when it lost the election.
Okay.
So there's a new actor on the stage, if you want, the Saudi Arabians. They have tried very hard to get an agreement that would meet international demands, an agreement between Fatah and Hamas. And the king in Saudi Arabia brought the two leaders together in Mecca just last month.
Right.
Now, we apparently, I haven't talked to anybody about it directly in the administration, but it's been clear we were pretty sour on that agreement because we felt that Hamas, the American side, felt that Hamas got the more out of it than Fatah.
Because they got the agreement without adopting the principles.
Without officially articulating the principles. I just would like to remind people that in 1975 we adopted a very similar policy about dealing with the PLO, and we held to it very consistently. We promised Israel we wouldn't deal with the PLO until they had accepted Israel's right to exist, the two UN Security Council resolutions, 242, 338, and renounced violence. We held to that for 13 years. 13 years in which I'm personally persuaded we could have done more to bring about a reconciliation between Palestinians and Israelis. In that sense, we wasted a lot of time. And I'm haunted by that memory as I talk about the situation today with Hamas.
Okay, this closes part one of our conversation. Next week we'll come back to the Palestinian-Israeli situation. We'll look at Saudi Arabia, Iran, Syria, all of which you're extremely familiar with. Thank you very much, and we'll continue it.
Thanks.